Okay, so today we're going to deal with Japanese expansion in East Asia, and we're going to start by talking about the origins of the factors that lead to Japan expanding in East Asia, and primarily focus on nationalism in Japan and militarism in Japan. And you're going to see right away on your standards that those are the first couple identifications you need to deal with. And we talked last week in our Origins of World War I discussion about what nationalism is and about what militarism is. So can I have anybody in here throw me a definition that you might use to define the word nationalism? Crickets, tumbleweeds, yes?
Like a country feeling passionate about their own country, like the citizens inside of it.
Very good. Feeling passionate about your own country, feeling maybe superior to the nations around you, absolutely. And Japan is gonna fit the bill in East Asia for this. And then militarism. What kind of things should we think about when we use the word militarism? Not just military, but militarism. So there's got to be like some kind of ideology behind it. Yes, ma'am. Okay, military in the nation is very important. Yes?
The will of the military best represents the will of the people.
Okay, the will of the military represents the will of the people, and maybe vice versa there too. Excellent. A country putting a lot of focus and emphasis on the development of their military. And when countries do that, we might see, as we are in Japan, the military having a pretty leading role in policy decisions of that nation. But we will get there. To start, I want to lay out four origins of this Japanese nationalism and militarism. Which, note, I already mentioned, the first required content is the origin of Japanese nationalism. I'm summarizing four of them for you right now. So these would be good bullets to get down in your notes. First, a determination by Japan to become a Western-style national power. Japan wants to be seen as one of the great powers of the world. We're going to go in much greater depth on all four of these. But just to start us off, let's lay out what the four are. So a determination by Japan to transform itself into a Western-style great power. So that's in terms of economics, it's in terms of military, it's in terms of education, in terms of economy. Japan wants to transform itself from a relatively isolated Asian nation to a global power. 2, Japan sees itself as the nation that should be leading East Asia, the Asian sphere. They believe it is their national destiny to lead the Asian sphere. I've used this phrase a couple times. We talked about the Chinese sphere of influence, or whenever we use the phrase sphere of influence. Like here we have Japan in East Asia, right? Japan sees all of this as its domain, or it at least should be its domain. As of right now, all of this is whose domain? Maybe we meant as of today, maybe China. But as of like World War I times and the years before, even though this is called China, who's really pulling the strings? Yes, Europeans and Americans, right? So, and then we've got France down here in what is known as French Indochina. So, you've got the British and you've got the French having more influence in Asia than Japan does, and Japan doesn't see that as right. Number 3, Japan, a relatively small nation, relatively small nation with lacking in arable land. You know that word, arable? Yeah, able to farm stuff on it. Very good. Japan is lacking in arable land compared to its large population. And they lack resources compared to the industrial growth that they want to see. So Japan needs raw materials. As such, they have a desire to become an imperial power. When I say imperial power, we're talking about a nation that wants to have an empire, and a couple of the primary reasons to create an empire is to be able to acquire raw materials for industrialization And then on the flip side of that production, to have markets to sell stuff to. Japan needs raw materials, Japan needs markets. Just like Britain needs raw materials and Britain needs markets. In fact, Japan and Britain are going to have a lot in common here. Each of them having relatively large populations with relatively limited resources. Japan being an island nation. Great Britain being an island nation. They're confined by their borders because of the water that surrounds them. So they've got to look outside. All right. Now, one note. We don't want to think of Japan as being too small, all right? And it's kind of hard to see on this map, but if I were to take Japan from its northernmost point to its southernmost point, and to pick it up, which is very difficult to do, but I've been working out, and take it to the United States and drop it down on our eastern seaboard, it would stretch from Maine down to Florida, all right? So it's a smallish nation in terms of like the United States or Soviet Union that we'll talk about, but it's not a tiny nation, all right? So 1, 2, 3, to become a Western-style power, to lead Asia, and to acquire raw materials. And number 4, Japan is rightfully perceiving discrimination by Western powers and the United States. They don't feel they're being treated as equals. They don't feel that they are seen as equal players on the global scene. Did you guys talk at all last year when you were dealing with like the progressive era and immigration into the United States about the Gentlemen's Agreement and the immigration acts that restricted particularly Asian immigration, particularly Japanese immigration into the United States? This is a slap in the face to the Japanese, who see themselves as certainly on par with their European and American counterparts. So Japan becoming a dominant player could start to change those discriminatory perceptions that are coming from the United States and coming from Europe. Cool? Cool. Now we got to go way back. Let's get in our way back machine and go all the way to 1853. Prior to 1853, and if you guys want to think back to your AP World days, you've learned this stuff before. Prior to 1853, for the 2.5 centuries before then, Japan remained and kept itself isolated from the European world. If you remember, Japan being an island nation, it helps it to be it can be isolated more easily, right? They can keep outsiders out a little bit more easily. In the late 1400s, some Europeans arrived in Japan from Portugal. And they brought some guns and they brought some Christianity to town. And Japan was like, okay, this is kind of interesting. By 1600, the door was slammed on that. Japan tried to drive out European influences, tried to drive out Christian influences. They held on to some of the guns. But they wanted the Christians largely out. They wanted the Europeans largely out. And for 2.5 centuries since that point, we can say safely that Japan was an isolated nation. 1853, that changes, and it changes with the arrival of an American and a fleet of ships. And that American is named Commodore Matthew Perry. You guys know this stuff. Did you talk about this last year, right? Kind of cool. How much, in your Japanese class, how much do you guys deal with Japanese history? Not much. Okay, cool. So if I screw up and say something wrong, you guys won't be able to call me out. Maybe. So in 1853, an American arrives. His name is Commodore Matthew Perry, P-E-R-R-Y. And he arrives with a new and modern, for its age, new and modern navy. And he invites his Japanese emissaries to come aboard these ships, to look at the shiny American cannons, and to look at other scientific and technological developments the Americans are bringing with them. Now, this is not just show and tell for the American Navy. Matthew Perry has a goal, and that goal is to essentially force open Japan, which had wanted to remain isolated and closed, to force open Japan to trade deals with the Americans. And as Japan is looking at this American Navy on its shore, they have to remember what China had already shown them. In the previous decades, Britain did much the same thing. Britain takes a modern navy to China to open up China to British trade, the way Britain wanted that trade to be carried out. China said, no, we've got this, Britain. We will allow you to continue to trade on a couple isolated ports, but that's it. All right? Britain wanted more, and they took their navy. And China wanted to close them out. So Britain used that navy in a series of conflicts known as the Opium Wars. You guys have heard of this. I think you guys remember it from AP World. And China had the doors blown open, and China was not able to resist British desires for trade into China. Following these Opium Wars, where China was defeated, Britain forced upon China what are known as unequal treaties. Basically, treaties that favor one side over the other. And of course, Britain is going to be favored in these treaty arrangements. And then other European nations would follow. America is looking for the exact same thing from Japan here in 1853, and they will absolutely get that. Following the arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry, Japan will be forced, essentially, into signing what is known as the Treaty of Kanagawa. Kanagawa. Essentially forcing the opening of Chinese ports and markets to American business. Japanese, I meant. Japanese markets to American business. This, like the predecessors in China, is an unequal treaty. It benefits the United States at the expense of Japan. For example, the United States is allowed in this treaty to dictate tariff rates for the Japanese. The United States starts the ball rolling, other European nations will follow. While Japan, because they open up their doors and they sign these unequal treaties before war comes to them, and we got to remember this, why does Japan not maybe stand up for itself a little? Like, the Chinese stood up for themselves and lost, right? They actually went to war against the British. Japan has a different story, though. Yes, ma'am? What's that? Okay, it certainly doesn't have the population that China has, doesn't have the resources that China has, doesn't have the development that China has at this point. But they're also, and we want to note this, they're also an island nation. They're also an island nation. And as an island nation, they've got to recognize that while a lot of the biggest cities in China are inland, and Britain certainly took ships up rivers to get to those islands, the largest cities in Japan, you don't have to go sailing up rivers to get there. A navy can just stay in the sea and destroy those cities. So Japan had to think very differently about how they handle this situation. Cool? Cool. All right. By 1868, Japan is going to see some major political change, and this major political change comes largely because of frustration within the Japanese elite that the Japanese shogun, the military leader who had long been ruling Japan, had essentially kowtowed to the Americans with these unequal treaties. There will be an event in Japanese history known as the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration. A return to preeminence of the Japanese emperor. For centuries, the Japanese emperor had taken a backseat to the ruling military shogun. Now the emperor, and his name is Meiji, the Emperor Meiji, is going to rise to preeminence again with what is known as the Meiji Restoration. This is a revolution in Japan. All right? The old government is essentially overthrown, and a new government is put in place. Authority is returned to the emperor. The Meiji Restoration shows that the Japanese were angry over bowing down to these humiliating treaties that the United States and other European nations imposed. And the Meiji Restoration will usher in a series of reforms in Japan. So Japan can stop taking that backseat to Western powers and start dictating themselves. Cool?